Mrs. Murray gently touched Meg's bruised cheek. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving admiration, half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with long, dark lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison to Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it tightly in braids. When she went into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up. But one side would come out curly and the other straight, so that she looked even plainer than before. You don't know the meaning of moderation, do you, my darling? Mrs. Murray asked. A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn. That's a nasty bruise by the Henderson boy that he gave you. By the way, shortly after you'd gone to bed, his mother called up to complain how badly you'd hurt him. I told her that since she's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are, I thought I was the one who ought to be doing the complaining. But she seemed to think it was all your fault. Suppose that depends on how you look at it, Meg said. Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry I tried to fight him. It just seemed an awful week, and I'm full of bad feeling. Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy head. Do you know why? I hate being an oddball, Meg said. It's hard on Sandy and Dennis, too. I don't know if they're really like everybody else or if they're just trying to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help. You're much too straightforward to be able to pretend to be what you aren't, Mrs. Murray said. I'm sorry, Meglet. Maybe if Father were here, he could help you, but I don't think I can do anything till you've managed to plow through some more time. Then things will be easier for you, but that isn't much help right now, is it? Maybe if I weren't so repulsive looking, maybe if I were pretty like you. Mother's not a bit pretty, she's beautiful, Charles Wallace announced, slicing liverwurst. Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age. How right you are, Mrs. Murray said. Just give yourself time, Meg. Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. No, thanks. He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of his mother. You'll also be along in a minute, Meg. I think I'll talk to Mrs. Whatsit about you. Who's Mrs. Whatsit? Meg asked. And I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while, Charles Wallace said. Onion, salt? Yes, please. Mrs. Whatsit stand for? Mrs. Murray asked. That's her name, Charles Wallace answered. You know the old shingled house back in the woods that the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live. They? Mrs. Whatsit and her two friends. I was out with Fortinbras a couple days ago. You and the twins were at school. Meg. We liked to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took off after a squirrel. And I took off after him, and we ended up by the haunted house. So I met them by accident, as you might say. But nobody lives there. Mrs. Whatsit and her friends do. They're very enjoyable. Why didn't you tell me about it before? Mrs. Murray asked. And you know, you're not supposed to go off our property without permission. Charles. I know, Charles said. That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed off after Fortinbras without thinking, and then I decided, well, I'd better save them for an emergency anyhow. A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. I don't think I like this wind, Meg said nervously. We'll lose some shingles off the roof, that's certain. Mrs. Murray said, but this house has stood for almost 200 years, and I think it will last a little longer. Meg, there has been many a high wind up on this hill. But this is a hurricane, Meg wailed. The radio kept saying it was a hurricane. It's October, Mrs. Murray said. They've been in October storms before. As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see the dark fur rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle. What's wrong? She asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murray's laboratory, which was in the old stone dairy right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, the pantry led outdoors, though Miss Murray had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door and not through her lab. But it was the lab door and not the garage door toward which Fortinbras was growling. You didn't leave any nasty-smelling chemicals cooking over on a Bunsen, did you, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murray stood up. No, but I think I'd better go see what's upsetting Fort, anyhow. It's the tramp. I'm sure it's the tramp, Meg said nervously. What tramp? Charles Wallace asked. They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all of Mrs. Buncombe's sheets. You'd better sit in the pillowcases then, Mrs. Murray said. I don't think even a tramp would be out on a night like this, Meg. But that's probably why he is out, Meg wailed, trying to find a place not to be out. In which case I'll offer him the barn till the morning. Mrs. Murray went out briskly to the door. I'll go with you. Meg's voice was shrill. No, Meg, you stay with Charles and eat your sandwich. Eat, Meg exclaimed as Mrs. Murray went out through the lab. How does she expect me to eat? Mother can take care of herself, Charles said. Physically, that is, but he sat in his father's chair at the table, and his legs kicked at the rungs, and Charles Wallace, unlike most small children, had the ability to sit still. After a few moments that seemed like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murray came back in, holding the door open for, was it a tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied about the head, and a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted through a rough overcoat, and rubber boots covered the feet. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles said suspiciously. What are you doing here? And at this time of night, too. Now, don't you be worried, my honey, a voice emerged from among the turned-up coat collar, stole scarves and a hat, and a voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. Mrs. Whatsit says she has lost her way, Mrs. Murray said. Would you care for some hot chocolate, Mrs. Whatsit? Charmed, I'm sure, Mrs. Whatsit answered, taking off the hat and the stole. It isn't so much that I lost my way as that I got blown off course, and when I realized that I was at Charles Wallace's house, I thought I'd just come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way. How did you know this was Charles Wallace's house? Meg asked. By the smell. Mrs. Whatsit untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flowered print, a gold Liberty print, a red and black bandana. Under all this sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot on top of her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose a round, soft blob, her mouth puckered like an autumn apple. My, but it's lovely and warm in here, she said. Do sit down, Mrs. Murray indicated a chair. Would you like a sandwich? Mrs. Whatsit, I've had liverwurst and cream cheese. Charles has had bread. Had bread and jam and Meg lettuce and tomato. Now let me see, Mrs. Whatsit pondered. I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar. You peaked, Charles cried indignantly. We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any. Mrs. Whatsit gave a deep and pathetic sigh. No, Charles said. Now you mustn't give in to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about a tuna fish salad? All right, Mrs. Whatsit said meekly. I'll fix it, Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish. For crying out loud, she thought, this old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and Mother takes it as though there weren't anything peculiar about it at all. I bet she is the tramp. I'll bet she did steal those sheets. And she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to ordinary people. I've only been in the neighborhood a short time, Miss Whatsit was saying, as Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with the tuna fish. And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all, until dear little Charles came over with his dog. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles Wallace demanded severely, why did you take Mrs. Buncombe's sheets? Well, I needed them, Charles dear. You must return them at once. But Charles dear, I can't. I've used them. It was very wrong of you, Charles Wallace scolded. If you needed sheets that badly, you should have asked me. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head and clucked. You can't spare any sheets. Mrs. Buncombe can. Meg cut up some celery and mixed it in with the tuna. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a jar of sweet little pickles. Though why I'm doing it for her, I don't know, she thought, as she cut them up. I don't trust her one bit. Tell your sister I'm all right, Mrs. Whatsit said to Charles. Tell her my intentions are good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Charles intoned. But isn't he cunning? Mrs. Whatsit beamed at him fondly. It's lucky he has someone to understand him. But I'm afraid he doesn't, Mrs. Murray said. No one of us is quite up to Charles. But at least you aren't trying to squash him down. Mrs. Whatsit nodded with her head vigorously. You're letting him be himself. Here's your sandwich, Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Whatsit. Do you mind if I take off my boots before I eat? Mrs. Whatsit asked, picking up the sandwich nervously. Nevertheless. Listen. She moved feet up and down in the boots, and they could hear her squelching. My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are a mite too tight for me, and I could never take them off by myself. I'll help you, Charles offered. Not you. You're not strong enough. I'll help. Miss Murray squatted at Mrs. Whatsit's feet, yanking off one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came suddenly. Mrs. Murray sat down with a thump. Mrs. Whatsit went tumbling backward with the chair onto the floor. Sandwich held high in one old claw. Water poured out of the book and ran over the floor and the big braided rug. Oh, dearie me, Mrs. Whatsit said, lying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air, one in a red and white striped sock, the other still booted. Mrs. Murray got to her feet. Are you all right, Mrs. Whatsit? If you have some liniment, I'll put it on my dignity, Mrs. Whatsit said, still supine. I think it's a sprained. A little oil of cloves mixed well with garlic is rather good. And she took a large bite of sandwich. Do please get up, Charles said. I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far. Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity? Mrs. Whatsit scrambled up, righted the chair, and then sat back down on the floor. The booted foot stuck out right in front of her, and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman. At least Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Whatsit, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray, now pull while I'm already down, quite calmly, as though the old woman in her boots were nothing out of the ordinary. Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot. The foot was covered with a blue-gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Whatsit sat there, wriggled her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. Ah, she said, that's ever so much better, and took both boots and shook them out over the sink. My stomach is full, and I'm warming inside and out. And it's time I went home. Don't you think you better stay till morning? Miss Murray asked. Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's so much to do. I just can't waste time sitting around frivoling. It's much too wild a night to travel in. Wild nights are my glory, Mrs. Whatsit said. I just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course. Well, at least till your socks are dry. Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing around in my boots. Now don't worry about me, Lamb. Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray. I shall sit down for a moment and pop on my boots, and I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, Pat, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract. Mrs. Murray went very white and with one hand reached backward and clutched a chair for support. Her voice trembled. What did you say? Mrs. Whatsit tugged at her second boot. I said, she grunted, shoving her foot down in, that there is, such a thing, as a tesseract. Her foot went down into the boot, and her grabbing shawls, scarves, and hat, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray stayed very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras sneaked in, panting, wet, and shining as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed. Mother, what's the matter? Meg cried. What did she say? What is it? The tesseract, Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known? That's it.